what he does and with the Pew and share some data with us from the Pew Center on the digital divide. And we've got Professor Olivier Sylvain, right? Did I pronounce your name correctly? So Professor Sylvain is at Fordham Law School, and he's also going to be talking about all the work and all the research that he does on issues of broadband, both in terms of the divide and in terms of some of the challenges that connectivity actually delivers as well. So we're going to be getting into that. We have a kind of a short session, but hopefully we'll get through all of these topics. And we're going to start off actually with some slides from the Pew Center, and John's going to speak a little bit about the current state of affairs as far as the digital divide and his perspective on it. But actually, let me get your slides up, because I realized I have my slides up. So here we are. So I'm going to let John start us off. And slideshow. Are we on?
No.
We don't have slides up on the...
Ironically, we're having internet problems.
That's funny.
Or not ironically. Yeah. Welcome to Tech Conference Producing.
Do you want to take this? Can you run it from up there?
That would be more problematic.
More problematic. Okay. If it continues, then what we'll do is we'll just speak to the data and... Oh, something happened. Something good happened. Yes. Yes. Woo. All right. Mission possible.
It went down again.
Oh, no. No, it didn't. There we go. Excellent. No. Yes. No. Ah, there we go. Can you just stand here and hold that? I don't think it's an internet issue. I think it's actually a hard wire issue.
You want to just stand in the closet?
Okay, we're gonna move on, right? Just let me see. You want to see if we have? I don't think so, but.
Or he was going to say.
Okay. Oh no, it's not. All right. I think we're gonna skip the slides. I'm sorry. So I'm gonna sit.
Okay.
I'm gonna take my notes. All right.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks again to Clayton and Bruce for having me up here. And I'm going to just talk about numbers for a few minutes. But what I was going to lead off with is a quote that I want us to ponder when thinking about data and the digital divide. And it's a quote from the sociologist Manuel Castells. And 10 years ago, just about 10 years ago, he wrote, with respect to the digital divide, the real inequality starts when we are all dependent on the internet. So think about that. The real inequality starts when we're all on the internet. And we're not all on the internet, are we? But so what Castells was speaking to is the fact that even though more people have more stuff, more assets with which to get online, other kinds of challenges emerge. So having been in this business of tracking people's technology usage patterns for about 16 years, I can tell you that what we all know, that more people have more stuff than any ever before on how to get online. In fact, it was 20 years ago when the Pew Research Center first asked people in surveys whether they use the internet. And in 1996, 14% of Americans said they were internet users. Some of us remember those days. Today, the data is switched. 85% of Americans have what I call advanced internet access. That means either they have broadband at home or they have a smartphone, two of the critical ways that we all have for getting online. In fact, 2/3 of all Americans have both ways of getting online, both a smartphone and broadband. I have a slide that picks apart that 85% number of people who have either broadband or a smartphone. And it shows that 72% of Americans have broadband at home. That's up about 6 or 7 percentage points over the past 5 or 6 years. But that 13% of Americans have a smartphone only as the way they go online. So we know lots of people have smartphones. 77% of Americans have a smartphone, but 13% have only a smartphone as their way of going online. When you dig into that 13% number, that number is a lot higher for communities of color and low-income people. Latinos, African Americans, low-income Americans, less educated Americans have much higher rates of smartphone only, above the average of 13% by about anywhere from 8 to 10 percentage points. And having a smartphone only as a way to go online means you have some constraints with respect to your online pathway. You're subject to data caps for the most part. You have a small screen, which makes it harder to carry things out like do homework. So even though the digital divide is closed and is narrowed quite narrowly, there are still some challenges when we start to dig into the data. Smartphones are helpful for closing the digital divide, but really having home broadband access is the anchor for people's internet usage patterns. So to use the phrase for the conference, broadband matters. The other point I want to make goes to what challenges are emerging now that the digital divide is narrowing. The digital divide is not unimportant, but as we go forward, I think it's important to pivot from talking about the digital divide to talking about digital readiness. And this refers to the things that matter in helping people being really able to navigate an online landscape. And there are two components to digital readiness: digital skills and trust in using the internet to find information. And our data at Pew show that 60% of Americans say they have trouble finding online information that they regard as trustworthy. And nearly half of Americans express concerns about their digital skills. So we have to, going forward, think about digital readiness and pivot to thinking about the kinds of steps that stakeholders have to take to help address digital equity issues. And that goes to training, and there's a large demand for training among people when you ask them in surveys. Over half of Americans would like to have training in digital skills. Over half would like to have training in how to determine what online information is trustworthy. So that requires stakeholders to think a little bit differently about digital equity issues, not just focus on the access gaps, but on the range of interventions that might be necessary to help close digital readiness gaps, which doesn't refer only to the people who are offline. Digital readiness refers to lots of Americans who express those concerns about skill deficits and trust deficits with respect to using the internet for important life activities. So with that, I will turn it over to Olivier. Or to Adriana
Well,
for...
to all of us. So the way we wanted to set up this conversation is basically to talk first about the digital divide, and sort of start off the conversation with what John was just talking about, some of the issues that we all see about that, and then talk about the cultural divide. So let's focus on some of the points that John was talking about. I think it's really important to really realize what he was saying, which is that even though the numbers look like the digital divide is disappearing, in fact, it continues to persist, and also it's qualitatively different to be thinking about a broadband connection to your home, to a bigger screen, and all the things that enables versus on a mobile device. And so let's talk about that. I mean, here we have in this room, we've got policymakers, we've got entrepreneurs, startups, we've got established media companies, and then we've got, everyday people who are just trying to think about how they can provide solutions. So coming from, your perspective and what you've studied and what you know, from thinking about all these different sort of factions, the policymakers, the business people, et cetera, what are some of the ways that they can help bridge this divide, and what are some of the biggest challenges?
Thank you, Adriana. And thank you all for having us. Thank you to Clayton for putting this together, and Bruce for spearheading this effort. I'm so pleased to sit on this panel with John because in a paper I just wrote relies heavily on research that he has produced, that Pew has produced, along with other researchers. The article Network Equality kind of takes up some of these points, and I think be responsive to your question by saying two things. So I want to linger on the first point that John made about the digging deeper into the ways in which disparities are now articulating themselves. But on the second point, I do want to observe this move to readiness is so important, because now I think while it's important to talk about divides, and it's one of the buzzwords, kind of like innovation, that we kind of throw out without real care, we are now past worrying just about the divide for its own sake and thinking about ways in which developing policy interventions that redress disparity, right? So what does that mean? So in one way, it's addressed to making sure people are ready, even if they are online, not just those who aren't. But as to the first, the research shows that poor people, and others have shown this, but poor people, black people, Latinos, are 2 times as likely, just to put this in a frame that's a different way, 2 times as likely as whites to use only a smartphone or cell phone, a mobile device, to access the internet. That is an articulation of disparity that is not just about access. It's about the abilities and uses, right? One recent intervention that helps to get at this is the FCC's Open Internet Order. We all talk about network neutrality. There's been a long-standing debate about this. But one of the things that the FCC recently did, and was affirmed by the DC Circuit not too long ago, is to incorporate broadband mobile access, right? Access through a mobile device in the picture about what is supposed to be open. That's an important shift that actually hasn't always been the case. Mobile was excluded from that category. So that's one policy intervention, right?
So can you explain for those of us who are lay people, what does that actually mean in everyday life? Like, how does that change?
Well, John said data caps, right? Well, we're going to live with data caps, right? Most of us live with data caps, whether we're getting a fixed line into our home or whether we have a mobile device. But there's also the possibility of a company throttling your connection or discriminating between different kinds of content, favoring affiliated content versus unaffiliated content. That was far more likely in a pre-open internet world than it is now. So we're addressing disparity. For those who are online, we're addressing disparity now that everybody has access to everything. I love Clayton's point about likening this stuff to the era of slavery. It means something if you are limited in the amount of information you get online. I want to say one more point about this, the policy implications. So a lot of the hot cases in the information law space, in particular with regards to privacy, involve surveillance of mobile devices, historical cell phone data. It's useful, very valuable information for purposes of law enforcement and a variety of things. What does this mean, though, in a world where we know that black people, brown people, are targeted by law enforcement in rates that are out of proportion to their number? We can be neutral about thinking about race when we are thinking about things as a matter of being online, but if they're 2 times as likely to be using a mobile device, there are clear policy implications there as well. Now, I don't have an answer for what that might be. It might be more attention to Fourth Amendment doctrine, privacy doctrine, but that's another important implication. This is all to say that policymakers need to move past concerns about divide for its own sake and think about the details in which disparities exist, attending to local considerations, right? Letting local communities attend to disparities as they are articulated as they are, giving people the tools to innovate that are particular to the ways in which they get online. Those are the 2 I would throw out as a big picture resolution to the problem.
So John, at the Pew Center, I mean, some of these sort of next generation broadband issues that Olivier was talking about. I mean, are you guys starting to look at these issues, for example, around surveillance and stuff?
Oh yeah, we are. We're looking at the gig economy. We're going to do something in the coming months or years on people's attitudes and behaviors when it comes to drones and smart cars and driverless cars and that sort of thing. So I mean, we're going to look to the future to try to track people's behaviors, and we'll be able to understand how those behaviors may vary by different demographic categories. But it will be, I think, to hit on my theme of digital readiness, important to try to really get the context right for how people are absorbing these new innovations. There's always a disconnect between the pace of innovation, the pace with which business can create new things, and the general population's ability to adapt. Now that's a state of nature, that's fine, yet I think the policy issues change when we start to deliver a whole range of services using digital means as governments, as schools, and that sort of thing. So you have to really be more attuned, I think, than in the past to that disconnect between the pace of innovation and the pace of adoption in the general population.
Right.
And can I just jump into this just to echo the point? I think this is where we now know that broadband is part of the range of utilities and services. And we should no longer fetishize the fact of access, right? Now we have to start thinking about how we integrate broadband in our lives and attend to inequality in the way that it's manifest in schools and in entrepreneurship.
Well, it's interesting when you think about what this really means. On the ground, Clayton was talking about these kids, not being able to do their homework,
And that's a great example, but it's also about filling out job applications, creating your resume, sending a cover letter. I mean, we noticed it at our own company. A lot of folks are using online platforms to submit their resumes, and these things don't come out looking the same when you print them out on the other end. If they're filled out, and there's no cover letter, and it's also this sort of mobile language and people writing.
So,
My daughter's on the screen.
Speaking of privacy, right? But for what it's worth, so Adriana, I think the stakes are, so what's at stake is the quality of homework, right? And the quality of the work that you supply because of the access that you have. But this, not to say that those are important, but the stakes are as high as access to telemedicine.
right?
Exactly.
The operation of infrastructures regarding, traffic management, right? I mean, there are so many reasons why broadband connections are important and that we should attend to the disparities that exist between communities.
Right. Yeah.
And just to buttress that point, there's a great story about how Boston, which has really been at the forefront of using data in city government to improve service delivery. So Boston rolled out one of the early leaders in rolling out 311 online systems, and so you could report a pothole in your neighborhood by just going to your laptop or smartphone even and say, well, we have a pothole in our neighborhood. What they found was all the neighborhoods with very high rates of tech use and connectivity were the ones reporting these at the greatest frequency. So they were, because of this, effectively getting better service.
Right.
Yeah, the potholes were real, but the well-off neighborhoods were getting quick response because they had the tools to ask for a quick response.
Right.
And so the solution isn't to slow down the pace of innovation, it's to understand that there could be inequities in how these things roll out and try to build in ways to address them from the get-go.
Right. And I think it's important to involve, the media companies and the distributors in this conversation. It's about policy, but obviously it's all about, these companies making investments to, I like that term about sort of digital readiness, because, there have been a lot of efforts. For example, Comcast has their Internet Essentials service, which provides low-income families with internet access. But how can media companies and distributors help bridge this digital readiness divide? Can we talk about that a little bit? What are some of the actual things they can do, presumably, if they want to help the communities?
Well, I think, media companies have changed, right? The political economy of what is a media company has changed. I don't think Google likes to be called a media company. I know they don't. I don't think Facebook likes to be called a media company. But I think we are, you're kind of invoking that same idea. These are companies that do far more than all of that. Google has invested, for what it's worth, and it's already been mentioned, and I have no money in the company for what it's worth, has invested in communities.
I bet you wish you did. Don't we all?
Maybe. I try to be independent.
Right. Well, you have
Right. There are so just because Google has been investing in fiber in communities across the country. There's some question about whether they are redlining in some of these communities. That's why I hedge at that. But that's an important intervention, right? To what extent? And I think they see a bottom line issue here for them, right? This is a competitive intervention that means to compete with incumbents to help lower prices for users. So, to the extent you're willing to accept that Google is a media company, I know that, they're an advertising and search company, but that's one way. Just invest in community infrastructure.
John, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, and I'll put on my policy guy hat. I worked at the Federal Communications Commission a few years back on the National Broadband Plan, and during that time, a lot of things were seeded at the community level through things like the Broadband Technologies Opportunity Program, which was part of the stimulus bill. And that actually set up, or seeded at least, a community infrastructure across the country designed to addressing these connectivity and readiness gaps. The money isn't there any longer, but the spirit and many of those entities are still alive. And what I think has been learned in the community of practice over the years is that partnerships matter. Meaning, your question was, what can these media companies do? They can partner with community institutions that effectively become kind of their marketing arms to get the job done of increasing not just connectivity and subscriptions, but the skill level of neighborhoods of all types who need to know how to figure out how to get their home energy system to work, or whatever the issue may be. So there are models that have evolved over the past 6 or 7 years that I think can be rebooted for the future, that go to the media companies, to get, again, to your question, reaching out to that infrastructure that exists.
Right, it's educational programs, it's all of that kind of stuff. So I think Clayton is telling me that we have 5 minutes. So, should we open it up to Q&A?
I think so. I'm going to bring the mic around. For me, it's like I'm at a Bruno Mars concert, man. This is so... Let me tell you, though, that's for me. This is riveting for me.
I do want to say one thing, Clayton, which is we didn't get to the other part of the conversation, which I wanted to talk about, which is the cultural divide. So
maybe that'll come up through these questions, because you can
but
see some of the people are already ready to go. Or next year. So you guys are all going to get a Ph.D. after this, by the way. Let's start here, and then we'll come to you.
Yeah, I moved into Harlem 7 years ago. I'm in a wonderful building. I can't get FiOS.
That's a whole other...
No, there's nuances, and the nuance has to do with, one, a lack of education to know that the piping is important. So we would have to pay for cosmetic improvements, and the co-op didn't want to pay for it, not realizing the power of it. And the second thing is these contracts that are brokered that gave us Spectrum/Time Warner/whatever merger this week is only in the building. My question to the panel is, in Harlem, where we have so many schools, can we not just get raw pipes into the schools, for instance, and let the schools decide who wants to pay for it? Give them that raw fiber, and what to do about the lack of
Haven't
good
you done
piping.
some work around broadband localism?
And let me say that you better stay, because the next panel is going to be talking about that too. We've got the man who runs Do It here. We've got people that are doing all of this work here. So you stay tuned. But however you guys want to address that issue.
Just quickly. So you mentioned FiOS. That is, and someone mentioned franchise agreements. I wouldn't say that the co-op board is the only reason why you don't have FiOS in your building. There's good reason to believe that that incumbent has not lived up to promises that were made uptown. Now, I say that as an independent speaker. The other point is that this is a great point about infrastructure, right? So there are mechanisms now in public law in the city and at federal level, this idea of build once. And it makes it easier for buildings to have the conduit for broadband if, when you build the building, there is a conduit for it. So there's that sort of thing happening. But all of this is infrastructure investment. It's fiscal policy. And, that's the sort of thing you need to push and lobby for, right? Make sure that legislators are attending to it.
Do you want to chime in?
Let's get the next question. We're only going to be able to take another question after Charles. Go ahead.
Real quickly, Charles Sheffield, citizen witness. I really wanted you to drill down on the FEC activities. When I pay my cell phone bill, some of the money is allegedly allocated for, I thought, communities that didn't have access. And I'm old enough to remember some venture capital firms in D.C. who brought us, Radio 1 and brought us BET. They had the right to rip up the streets and actually, implement broadband services. They had to put up millions and millions of dollars to do it as a private effort. Where is the money? If we are paying for it every day in my cell phone bill, there's billions of dollars. Why can't we purpose that? What's going on with that?
Coming from a money man.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, at the Pew Research Center, we stay away from making recommendations about policy. As somebody who many years ago was on a cable franchise authority in Texas, you're talking about either franchise fees that go to local government, and there's a portion of your bill that goes to the Universal Service Fund. And that's an instance where your voice ought to be made heard to policymakers about what community needs are, and make the case to them and see if it's persuasive, whether there's a disconnect between where the money is going as opposed to where you think it ought to go.
Okay, last question. Who has the last question? Oh, Lou has one. Let me bring you the mic, Lou. I know every single person here, right?
You're unbelievable. Thank you so much. This is a great panel. Olivier, you said something that is a model that's been used around the world that has been very effective, which is the open access model. They did that in Sweden, in Stockholm. They built an open access network, and the municipal government said as a policy, this is important to us. We're going to dig once. We're going to put it in, and anybody that wants to connect to it can. So they've got 115 providers now providing service into the most competitive economy in Europe. And there's a correlation between that. But what concerns me is that we talk about relying on the incumbents to do this. It's like having that girlfriend or that boyfriend that cheats on you 5 times, but the 6th time you know they're not going to do it because of the way they smiled at you. Well, guess what? If they keep smiling at you, they're going to do it the 6th time because they got the same smile the first 5 times. But here's the deal. You gotta do a fight and hold strategy. So you're not going to get this done all at once. The first strategy, though, is to use resources that exist in your community. And that would be libraries. We're seeing libraries, and I'll just put out this one thought. We're seeing libraries increasingly become the first point of contact for the broadband that's necessary to overcome digital divides. And that's a very significant place to go because the resource exists. Very few people will argue about funding a library, and people trust it. And so when we think about this at the Intelligent Community Forum, we think about incremental strategies, not trying to bust an incumbent all at once, because those guys will fight you in the courts forever. So we try to go around them.
John mentioned partnerships, and
Yeah.
I think that's part of the story. Multi-stakeholder approaches, where you focus on anchor institutions that are particular to the community. Libraries have played that role. Churches have played that role. Schools have played that role. And in New York City, we know that the libraries are stepping up in this regard. So you're exactly right.
Yeah, and it's only going to happen at the local level. I mean, this is a revolution, and you have to think about it. How do you build your cell to accomplish this? And this is what these guys are doing. So thank you.
Thanks,
So,
Lou.
I think
Address
I just wanna
address whatever you want to address. I do want to say
Yeah.
we got to get right into the next
Yeah.
panel. We can take a couple of minutes break if you want, or if you want to go right into the next panel. If you're like me, you probably got to just hold your water. But either way, let's get your
wanted to-
comment, and then we can take a poll or something.
I just wanted to say that I am really sorry that we had the technical difficulties this morning. We will make our slides available, and I had some video. So I'm going to send Clayton a Dropbox link with all of this content, including John's slides. And if you reach out to the folks at Silicon Harlem, they'll make those available to you as well.
We got just one other quick comment, and then we're going to wrap it up.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on universal service. I think that applies to the common carrier designation, Title II, and with telcos. it doesn't apply to broadband at this point. So
Thank you.
That's a very good point. All right, so let's do a quick 5-minute break just to stretch, get ourselves ready for this power-packed panel, which is going to actually talk about why broadband matters. So enjoy the next couple of minutes, and we'll get right back in here so you can get a seat. Love you guys.